I am in my 6th year on the San Francisco Historic Preservation Commission, and that work has been somewhat eye-opening as to a lot of the changes that are happening in what we're preserving and what we're looking at preserving. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that tonight. And I'm not a lecturer per se, so I have written stuff, so I'm sorry if I'm reading some stuff, but it's the only way I'll get the information out. And because it's Groundhog Day, you all are going to have to come back again tomorrow, and we're going to do this all again. So this amazing image right here is the ceiling of the rotunda entrance of the Hibernia Bank building, which I had the privilege of working on, and I'm going to talk about that as a specific project. And then the macro view, I want to talk about San Francisco and the paths of preservation that we're pursuing right now. So with the frenetic pace of change and economic pressures and the volume of building that's been happening over the past half decade in San Francisco, the fabric of the city has been stretched and manipulated in ways that haven't been seen since the 1906 earthquake in the city. In periods like this, there's the distinct possibility that many of those things that define the urban character and the social context, they can be lost without vigilance and without a clear idea of what is important. Preservation, from a social context point of view, is not a science. Knowing what to keep and what to let go of in the process of evolution of a place is a delicate and tricky dance. It requires a clear vision of the values of history and the discernment as to levels of significance of the facts of a building, a place, landscape, or sociocultural heritage. Through the diligent work of the preservation staff of San Francisco Planning Department, with the guidance of the Historic Preservation Commission, the city is for the most part its character is being retained, based in the reality of not just the super buildings, the important ones that we all know about, the superstars, but also in the neighborhoods and the people that make up the complex fabric of San Francisco. Everyone knows the myth of San Francisco, the cable cars, the Golden Gate Bridge, the wiggly part of Lombard Street, and it's known, of course, for its natural and physical beauty. Like any place, its history is written in its buildings and mapping, in its shaping of the urban form over the last 170 years. But most people only know San Francisco from its most iconic buildings and places. Certainly San Francisco has its share of those, like these, the mythic image of the houses at Alamo Square that everyone knows. But of course, any city is far more than the sum total of its moments. The seminal shaping event for San Francisco, really embedded in its DNA, is of course the 1906 earthquake and fire, with its grand and ornate city hall, along with its many classically derived buildings that were arrayed along Market Street. The city was called the Paris of the West. In about a minute, on April 19th, 1906, what remained of the city looked something like that. The city hall collapsed in a matter of about a minute, and the city lay in ruin after 3 days of fire that followed. While there were earlier plans for the design of the city, including the Beaux-Arts-inspired plans of Daniel Burnham, the formal planning of San Francisco really began in earnest in the post-earthquake and fire years, as the city rose like a phoenix from its rubble. And the first planning commission the legislation was in 1912, and the first planning commission was seated in 1917. So we literally just had our centennial of the planning department just last fall. So in 1967, just a year after the passage of the National Historic Preservation Act, San Francisco passed its first historic preservation laws in the adoption of the Planning Code's Article 10, Preservation of Historic, Architectural, and Aesthetic Landmarks, and the implementation of the code was entrusted to the newly created Landmarks Preservation Advisory Board, which was made up of 9 mayoral appointees that reported to the Planning Commission. And that's an important distinction, which I'll explain later. The plight of specific endangered buildings and districts often provided the energy, just like in New York with the loss of Penn Station, that kind of fostered the whole beginning of the preservation movement in the country. The loss of the Fox Theater, the Fontana Warehouse, and many of the Victorians in the Western Addition really helped to kick off the preservation efforts in San Francisco. The early days of landmarking were filled with the golden nuggets, those buildings and areas of the city, many of which were either pre-earthquake, beautiful and unique architecture, or founding places, like this one on the left here is Mission Dolores, is landmark number 1. And it was an obvious choice. And after that, churches, banks, theaters, and already well-preserved Victorian homes. City Hall here in San Francisco is landmark number 21. And then on the top, the Conservatory of Flowers in Golden Gate Park and Ghirardelli Square are obvious choices for landmarking. The 1970s and 80s were a fertile period for historic preservation. In 1985, Article 11 of the Planning Code was established, which created conservation districts, which are very similar to historic districts, but they were focused in the downtown and Union Square area. This code introduced innovative new preservation methods, such as the transfer of development rights. And some of you may know about where a historic building has an envelope that is zoned for something much bigger, and they could then sell those rights to a developer and then get money to restore and rehabilitate a historic building. And at the time in 1985, that was fairly innovative. Just as the losses in the 60s had inspired the movement, there was great losses in the 1980s as well, including the City of Paris store, which many of you might remember. By 1980, there were 121 landmark buildings, but only one historic district, which was Jackson Square, established in 1972. By 2000, there were over 1,000 buildings and places in 9 historic districts, 6 conservation districts, and 227 individual landmarks. So here you see some of the very important buildings: the Alcazar Theater on the left, the Halliday Building, which is considered, I'm sorry, these are a little not quite as clear, but the Halliday Building, the first curtain wall building in the country, the very famous Centennial Building where Francis Ford Coppola spends his time now, and the Bank of California. And then other movie theaters around the city. The Castro Theater is landmark 100. The new Mission Theater was recently renovated and restored, is landmark 245. One of my favorite buildings in the city, this one in the upper right, is the Roos House by Bernard Maybeck. Is in the Presidio Heights neighborhood, just an absolutely spectacular house. And the Haas Lilienthal House, some of you may know about San Francisco Architectural Heritage Group, which has its headquarters in the Haas Lilienthal House. In 2008, voters passed Proposition J, which replaced the Landmarks Preservation Advisory Board with a new Historic Preservation Commission. This body reports directly to the Board of Supervisors and is made up of 7 members, 6 of whom are required to be preservation professionals. And it is a significant difference when the Landmarks Preservation Advisory Board literally advised the Planning Commission. So was just in an advisory capacity. As a commission, the Historic Preservation Commission reports only to the Board of Supervisors, so any appeals and things, and it just gives it more power to help preserve buildings and create districts. Sure. Yeah.
Was that the family connected with Roos Afton stores that were there?
I believe so, yeah. I believe they were department stores. Yeah. Yeah. So by the end of 2017, there were 276 landmark structures, 13 historic districts, with 1,229 buildings and approximately 500 buildings in 6 conservation districts. The total comprises about 6% of the buildings in the city. So at some level, that's not very much, because 94% is not under any sort of historic look. But that is changing. So we do have some ability to affect change beyond just the historic districts in the city and the landmarks. There are 13 listed historic districts in San Francisco, mostly on the north and east side of the city. The ability to identify and preserve the character of well-developed areas with consistent architectural character was part of the original legislation in 1967. So here we have the Liberty Hill District is a well-preserved area. It's in the Noe Valley neighborhood. Of pre-earthquake, mostly Victorian homes, and a lot of them are freestanding, which is a unique character in San Francisco. They're not row house types. The upper right here is the Civic Center Historic District, perhaps one of the great collections of Beaux-Arts period, classically inspired buildings, probably in the country. It's one of the best civic centers in the country. The lower left here is Jackson Square Historic District, which is in the area of the original settlements of San Francisco, the Barbary Coast area, Many of these buildings are brick buildings on very narrow streets. This is Gold Alley, Gold Street. And if any of you have been to Bick's restaurant, it's right there in the middle of that alley. And then this one on the right is one of the more recently designated districts, the Dogpatch Historic District. It's a very interesting one because it's in an area at the central waterfront area. You can see the bay in the background. And a significant number of the buildings in this district are small cottages, small Victorian period cottages that were for the workers, the maritime workers who worked at the docks. And you can kind of see here the building to the left of the smokestack is, all of that is part of Pier 70, which is right now, that building to the left of the smokestack is being renovated right now. And that whole area is undergoing a very significant development that has just been approved. Some of the buildings are already underway. And the hill in the background on the right is called Irish Hill. And that hill doesn't exist anymore. There's a little stub of a hill that's about 25, 30 feet high, and that's part of the landscape of Pier 70. But that hill was eroded by industry over the years, so even that piece of the landscape is being preserved now. The conservation districts, they're similar to a historic district, but they're located specifically in the downtown financial district and Union Square area. And fortunately, a focus of preservation of the dense late 19th century and early 20th century buildings in the 1985 downtown plan, which was a massive zoning change specifically aimed at the preservation of the downtown area. And it helped to secure the historic character as the city was rapidly developing and evolving. And if some of you were there at the time, there was a lot of talk of the Manhattanization of San Francisco. So the conservation districts were a way to kind of secure areas so they wouldn't be torn down for new high-rise development there. These don't have names that roll off the tongue. They're basically named for the streets they're on. So the one in the upper photograph is the New Montgomery Mission 2nd Street Conservation District, which is just south of Market Street in the area centered around 2nd. And the one below in the Union Square area is the Kearney Market Mason Sutter Conservation District. Most of the historical planners, call it the KMMS district because the names are very hard to say. So starting around the late 1990s, we started looking at some cultural landmarks as opposed to the physical buildings as landmarks. So starting in the late 1990s, a number of landmarks began to recognize people and social and cultural events that contributed to the character of San Francisco. For many of these, the building's architecture was considered secondary to the spirit of the place that made it a landmark. Although CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, identifies that a building or place can be considered a historic resource in its association with events or people significant to history, the specifics of the landmarks in San Francisco to that date had been typically related only to the architectural character or quality of a building. In 2001, City Lights Booksellers and Publishers was designated as an official historic landmark, and it was the first time that this had been granted to a business rather than a building. The report cited the organization for, quote, playing a seminal role in the literary and cultural development of San Francisco and the nation, and it acknowledged City Lights Publishers for its, quote, significant contribution to major developments in post-World War II literature. On the left side here, the Twin Peaks Tavern, which is at Market and Castro Streets, was the first gay bar in the country that featured expansive windows allowing the LGBT patrons to be visible from the street. This, quote, opening of the closet door was far more significant than the building, which is a fairly common example of the 1920s Mediterranean commercial architecture that's fairly common in the neighborhood districts of San Francisco. This one's particularly dear to me. 2362 Market Street is a fairly ordinary example of a mission-style commercial building that was built in 1910 as the Jose Theater, which was one of the first movie theaters in the city, which in and of itself is notable but not necessarily worthy of landmark status. In 1987, it became the home of the Names Project, the organization that shepherded the AIDS Memorial Quilt. And this one is particularly dear to me because I wrote the report for the designation, as well as spent many hours volunteering for the Names Project and the quilt. So it became a landmark because of the people and activities that happened here over 15 years. Again, in and of itself, the building itself is not that significant. Right now it's a restaurant called Catch. It's a seafood restaurant. And fortunately, the owner of the restaurant has a rotating display of panels of the quilt in the entrance area. So the association with why it is a landmark is still present in the building. So these are some other recent cultural landmarks. On the left, Sam Jordan's bar. Sam Jordan was kind of the mayor of the Bayview and was the first African-American man to run for mayor of San Francisco. It's been in continuous operation since the 1950s. His sons are now running the bar. And again, you can see it's a rather ordinary building in and of itself, but the significance of Sam Jordan is the reason this building has been designated. Some of you who grew up in San Francisco may know about the Doggy Diners, which were a popular chain. This is located in the Sunset neighborhood, right across from the entrance to the San Francisco Zoo. Perhaps the funkiest landmark in the city. It celebrates the rise of car culture and one of the kookiest hamburger chains in the country. So that's one of the last few of the doggy heads that are still around. And then this one on the right is, while it's a very good example of early 20th century commercial architecture, it was built by R.L. Goldberg, who was known as Rube Goldberg. So many of you who know about what a Rube Goldberg device is. This one was particularly enjoyable when Rube Goldberg's granddaughter came to speak to us, and she had put a book together on his amazing contraptions and cartoons. And she talked about her memories of Rube Goldberg. So preservation in San Francisco took a turn towards a more global and inclusive view of history with the inauguration of the Legacy Business Historic Preservation Fund. Proposition J, passed in 2015, is the first legislation in the nation to recognize notable small businesses as historic assets and incentivizes their preservation. San Francisco's Legacy Business Program recognizes that the city's unique character is equally defined by its historic neighborhoods and the people, businesses, and uses that enliven them. San Francisco wouldn't be San Francisco, of course, without its many independently and locally owned businesses. The city's neighborhood businesses, including retailers, restaurants and cafes, service providers, manufacturers, nonprofit organizations, and more, are the places that give the city its character. As of 2017, there were over 120 businesses registered as legacy businesses, and well-known businesses include, some of you may know some of these. Oh, sorry, I went one too far. There we go. The Anchor Oyster Bar, Boudin's Bakery is the oldest operating business in San Francisco. It was started in 1849. So some of the people panning for gold probably ate bread from Boudin's Bakery. Britex Fabrics, Cafe Trieste, City Lights Books, Flax Art and Design, Great American Music Hall, Sam's Grill and Seafood Restaurant. They're in districts all over the city. A legacy business is defined as a business that has been nominated by a member of the Board of Supervisors or mayor that meets the following three criteria. The business has operated in San Francisco for 30 or more years. The business has contributed to the neighborhood's history and or identity of a particular neighborhood or community. And the business is committed to maintaining its physical features or traditions that define the business, including craft, culinary, or art forms. And while the others are businesses that tourists may know, these are neighborhood businesses that pretty much are only known to people from those specific neighborhoods. So things as unique as the Arrow Stamp and Coin Company, the Golden Gate Fortune Cookie Company, and this was my favorite, Gypsy Rosalie's Wig and Vintage. And Gypsy herself came in with this very spectacular wig to tell us about her business. A karate studio, Project Open Hand, which is food for people who are shut in, Sam Jordan's Bar. The last one here, Zam Zam, is one of the strangest bars that you could ever go into, one of the most enjoyable strange places you could go in the Haight neighborhood. And you can see, again, these are all over town. Sunset, Chinatown, North Beach, the Excelsior, Japantown, etc. Another unique path for preservation in San Francisco that we are looking at now is the recognition of tangible and intangible cultural heritage that makes up so much of the city's history. Such social and cultural heritage resources include buildings and monuments, as well as businesses, institutions, organizations, events, and traditional arts, crafts, and practices. Cultural heritage is the expression of a community's ways of living through beliefs, customs, practices, artistic expression, and significant places. It inspires community pride and awareness of local historic resources, emboldening a sense of identity and responsibility to the society at large. In addition, the identification of these cultural districts can stave off rampant gentrification, as we had just been talking about, and the homogenization of the unique neighborhoods of the city. So right now, there's a few cultural districts. On the upper left, Japantown Cultural Heritage District. Upper right, something called the Compton's Transgender, Lesbian, Gay, and Bisexual District. Compton's Cafeteria was a place where a lot of late night activity happened in the Tenderloin neighborhood. And 3 years before the Stonewall Uprising in New York, in 1966, there was an uprising against the police at Compton's Cafeteria. So this is one of the newest districts. On the bottom right here, the Calle 24, the Latino Cultural District located in the Mission neighborhood, and the Soma Pilipinas Cultural District for the Filipino community that's located in the south of Market area. So there's ongoing preservation work. I mean, that's basically where we are now. We're looking at specific landmarks, we're looking at cultural landmarks, we're looking at new kinds of districts, cultural heritage districts. And San Francisco has gone from kind of lagging behind in the early days of preservation now to becoming a leader in the nation for its innovative and conscious programs that serve to preserve the city, its buildings, landscapes, and its social and cultural heritage. Current and ongoing programs of the preservation program of the Planning Department include a citywide survey of all the buildings. So when I mentioned the 6%, we don't even know what's out there. So we're just starting to look at a major citywide survey. Los Angeles beat us by decades in doing that. Increasing the recognition of cultural heritage, ensuring that preservation is a primary attribute of new area plans. Most of you know, if you're from San Francisco or have been there recently, there are significant areas that are being redeveloped. So those area plans, we're looking at preservation as a primary attribute of those plans. And increasing the pace and number of landmarked buildings and landscapes. So that's kind of the macro view. I want to shift to a more micro view. So this is the Hibernia Savings and Loan Society, more commonly known as the Hibernia Bank. This is on Jones Street on the right, McAllister to the left, and essentially Market Street cuts across at an angle right in front of this building at this intersection. The bank was established in 1864 and opened its first building in 1869. And then in 1889, the bank board of directors held a national design competition for their new building, promising a $1,000 prize, which then was probably $50,000, some amazing amount of money. The competition rules stipulated that, quote, the proposed building must be in the classic style of architecture and solely for the accommodation of the bank's vast businesses. I love that. This was in 1889, was 4 years before the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893, where classical architecture, was seen across the country for the first time. So the bank was really looking at a very modern, cutting-edge architecture at the time. 20 architects from the Bay Area and across the East Coast submitted plans for the competition. San Francisco architects Albert Peisis and William Moore won the competition. The new building was projected to cost $400,000. Again, another number that we all can chuckle at now. Albert Peisis was an amazing architect that very few people know much about. He was one of the most important San Francisco architects of the late 19th and early 20th century. He was born in Mexico in 1857 to a Mexican mother and French father and brought to California as a young boy. So essentially he was a dreamer. He was one of the first Americans to attend the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and interned in Paris from 1872 to 76. He returned to San Francisco and began a partnership with William Moore in 1882, designed many Victorian, large-scale Victorian homes. We've been able to find very little about William Moore, and his name kind of disappeared from Pises's work by the mid to late 1880s. So some of the noted pre-earthquake works of his include the Vale House on the left, which is landmark number 168 from 1885. Of course, the Hibernia Bank Building is landmark 130 from 1892. The Parrott Building, and many of you would know that as the Emporium or the Westfield Center on Market Street from 1896. The one in the middle, Temple Shereth Israel on California Street from 1904. And on the right, the Flood Building, landmark number 154 from 1904. I love this quote. This is from 1909 from the Architect and Engineer magazine. The architect who has been responsible for more graceful, dignified, and well-planned structures on the streets of San Francisco than any single practitioner in the Bay City. He was really very well respected. Today he would be considered what we call a rock star. He was pretty much the rock star architect. After the earthquake, a lot of architects came to prominence. There was obviously a significant amount of work. And the buildings, some of the buildings he did at that time, the building on the left, the Burrell Building, 1908, is landmark 109. The Mechanics Institute, this is the staircase image in the middle, is landmark number 134 from 1909. The White House Department Store, some of you may know in San Francisco, the Banana Republic store in the Union Square area, was his design, 1909. And the Health Sciences Library here on the left, or on the right, landmark 115 from 1912. And you can see peeking out on the right there is the dome of Temple Shereth Israel. He has the distinction of having the most buildings, the most landmarked buildings in the city. So his work is pretty substantial. And I think the thing that's very interesting about him is that with the earthquake, so many of his buildings remained intact. He had an incredible engineering sense. He engineered his own projects. And what we found out in working on the Hibernia Bank was just how successful he was. So the building was built from 1890 to 1892. In these photos, on the lower left-hand corner, the upper photo from about 1891, while the building was under construction, and the lower left here, circa about 1895, the building completed. And then again, this is Market Street, the major boulevard here. It had, at the time, fairly unique concrete perimeter foundation. He used cast iron columns with steel I-beams, and I'll show you some of those in some later photographs. The granite on the building, on the two street facades on McAllister and Jones, was from Rockland, California. And what was pretty impressive was typically when you see columns, big columns on classical buildings, you'll see a little pinstripe. And those columns usually were made in drums. They were made in parts. And what's pretty remarkable about these is they're all one piece. They're about 30 feet high, and they're carved out of one piece of granite. So that was a pretty significant piece. And that actually helped during the earthquake to help keep the building up. The back is, the rear walls are brick, and the rotunda entry is capped by a burnished copper dome over an iron, some beautiful curved iron structure up there. Upon completion of the building, it was said to resemble, quote, a number of well-known public buildings of Paris, and there is about it much suggestion of the Bank of England. The building was called, quote, a banking palace. It was named the most artistic building in town and called, quote, an illustration of beauty, design, exquisite material, and splendid workmanship. So the bank was expanding quite a lot because the picture on the left is circa about 1900, and on the right you can see that the building is bigger. In 1904, the bank hired Pisus again to do an addition and added on the west side of the building about 4 bays, so it pushed it out further and essentially made it symmetrical around the corner rotunda entrance. The work on that addition was completed in January 1906, 3 months before the earthquake. So this is a photo from literally just days after. This is probably the 3rd week of April in 1906. Although the building was touted as fire resistant, the fires that followed the earthquake badly damaged the interior, but remarkably not the safes. Investigation revealed that the flames from the outside did not seem to cause the igniting of the structure. The structural granite just outside the windows was chipped by the heat from inside, and, quote, the superheated interior of the bank burst into flames, and everything that was flammable was ablaze in an incredibly short period of time. Glass fuses at a temperature of about 500 degrees. The heat must have been that in the bank interior, for we found glass bottles fused to the glass of the windows. So that must have been an amazingly strange thing. But what was really quite remarkable, and this photo really shows it, is that in the face of complete destruction, and actually if I go back one, the City Hall, the dome of the City Hall is there on the left. And that the City Hall pretty much collapsed during the earthquake. And the only thing that seemed to be affected, other than the fire damage, on the Hibernia were the balustrades on the top, and not even on the Jones side, but on the McAllister side, those balustrades had fallen over. But that was pretty much the only structural damage to the building. And it clearly wasn't just a matter of chance. What we found out, and I'll go through some of the structural work that we did on the building, was that it was a pretty amazingly stout building for the time. This upper one's one of my favorite shots from the time. It took a full month before the bank vaults were cool enough that they could actually handle it to open the doors. You know, they have the big cranks on the safe doors, and amazingly it didn't fuse. The temperature did not get hot enough to melt the steel of the vault, but it took that long. And what they found was that everything inside the safes was intact. So the Hibernia was pretty much the only bank at the time that had any money. So within 5 weeks of the fire on May 25th, 1906, to blocks 5 and 6 blocks long, it was reopened and clearly had the proper security at the time to make sure that everything went well. And the reason they needed the security mostly was because they were handing out money on the street, because of course the interior had been burned at the time. So these are some pictures that I took in 2009. It was pretty tired by then, but still in amazingly good, pretty much in good shape. So after World War II, like so many banks across the United States, the Hibernia Bank expanded, ultimately having 21 branches around the Bay Area. The name of the bank gained international notoriety, of course, in 1974, when Patty Hearst and members of the Symbionese Liberation Army robbed the Hibernia Bank, but it wasn't this main facility. It was a branch on Noriega Street in the Sunset District. By the 1970s, Market Street and the Tenderloin area neighborhood around it went into steep decline. And although there had been new coats of paint in 1980, the building was pretty tired. The bank decided to move its headquarters and built a high-rise in downtown San Francisco in the 1980s, and the main branch here was officially closed and mothballed in 1985. In 1988, the Hibernia Bank was gone from existence. It was bought by the Security Pacific Bank, and then subsequently Security Pacific was bought by the Bank of America in 1992. So this building was sitting there pretty much empty and mothballed. But from 1991 to 2000, it was leased by the San Francisco Police Department. And fortunately, they only used the basement level as a substation for the Tenderloin police station. But by 2000, again, the building was closed and mothballed. It was purchased by Irish immigrant Tom Hunt in 2008 for, at the time, the bottom basement price of $3.8 million, which at the time was the price of a very nice home in Palo Alto. But he got this building, this 40,000 square foot building, which was pretty much a white elephant at the time. So I don't think he knew what he was getting into. But as an Irish immigrant who had done very well in San Francisco, he felt that bringing the Hibernia Bank with its Irish roots back would be his gift from his generation to San Francisco.
What was his name?
Tom Hunt. The restoration and renovation project was completed between 2014 and 2016. So this is the interior of the banking hall. I'll tell you a little bit about the project, but what was really remarkable was pretty much the bank was closed for about 25 years and mothballed for almost 25 years when we started. And it was in remarkably good condition, and amazingly no graffiti, a little bit of water intrusion, but very little. And being a bank, you can see in those windows in the back, there were metal shutters that coiled up into behind the, up above the windows. They had a coil for these to be cranked down on the outside so no one could see into the building, and it really helped to protect the building. And then the skylight you see up at the top has a greenhouse over it, so that's really just a lay light. That's not exposed to the elements. So the skylights above are wire glass, and again, they were fairly intact. So the building was in relatively good condition. What you can see here is the original bank building was this side of those two columns, and then the addition was from the two columns to the back. And the original back wall of the building looked exactly the same. So ostensibly, they just moved that wall and reconstructed it further back. So the project, we didn't have a specific tenant to design to. So the project, we were asked to do the following work to restore and preserve the building. So seismic strengthening. Let me flip the slide here. It's another shot into the main banking hall. Maximize the occupancy allowed in the building, maximize the usable space in the building, provide access to the rooftop penthouses that were fairly hard to get to, add require restroom facilities, bring the building up to ADA code, add fire suppression system throughout, and provide code compliant exiting. And then, of course, the actual restoration of the work of the fabric of the building. So these are a few shots. These were taken in 2012. It's really a remarkable building. The plaster work and the gold leaf work, again, were mostly in pretty decent condition. Prior to, as I mentioned, the interior had been repainted in 1980. So you can imagine between 1907-8, when it was rebuilt after the fire, to 1980, people still smoked. And so there was probably a lot of nicotine on the surfaces here, and it was probably pretty dirty. So fortunately, from 1980 to 1985, there wasn't much damage done to the building. And again, it was kept pretty much intact. I think there were 21 different marbles used in the building. You can see in this picture on the right. There's something like 8 or 9 different marbles just right in that area. The plaster work is just absolutely remarkable. As a relatively modern architect who was trained in the 1970s and 1980s, the idea that people drew this by hand and then had craftsmen who could actually build it, it just blows me away. I mean, it's really quite a remarkable thing. One of the things we did as well was all of the lighting fixtures. A significant number of the lighting fixtures were intact. So we took all of them down, cleaned them, and rewired them for LED lighting. One of the really impressive pieces of the project was the seismic strengthening of the building. We worked with a firm called Wist, Janney and Elstner, WJE, who specializes in historic structures. They were the structural engineer, and what essentially was done was we literally essentially built a building inside the fabric of the structure of the building, and I'll go over what that means. So what they did was they did an incredible analysis of the existing building, because from their point of view, modern codes for structural design would not really even allow a building like this to be built, because modern codes are based on steel frames and floating floors and things like that. They're not based on heavy masonry construction. So they did an evaluation of good quality earthquake photographs like these that showed the only damage to the structure appeared to be the rooftop parapet balustrades, with no apparent cracking, displacement, or loss of masonry due to shaking. So one of the things they talked about were these columns, and they talked about rocking, that during the earthquake, if they were drums, they probably would have shifted. but because they were one piece, the speed of which an earthquake wave goes through allowed them to just move slightly, and they call that rocking. So they also in 2009 did a very detailed interior and exterior evaluation of the building, and again they found that there were very few signs attributable to earthquake movement and shaking. There were also maps done there was a lot of mapping done in 1906 and plans published in 1908 that really diagrammed where the shaking was, what the values of shaking around the city. So they used those maps and then future USGS maps to then estimate what kind of shaking was happening at the time of the earthquake in this location. So then they did some pretty sophisticated computer modeling. I can't begin to tell you specifically what all this is, but what I do know is these two lower images on the right are showing stresses in the building. They did 33 masonry shear tests throughout the building, and it indicated that the masonry was of extraordinary quality, both the masonry itself, the granite and the brick, as well as the mortar was still in remarkably good condition. And so these analyses then allowed them to know where to put different, how to design a system to withstand the forces. And what was really remarkable was these are drawings of something called core drilling. So essentially, like an oil wildcatter goes out and he digs a really big hole down to find oil, they designed a system that had 166 core drills through the walls of the building, through the columns. So you can see in some cases they went from the roof all the way down. In other cases, like at the top drawings, they just have these pins that go through the cornices and the balustrades. And what that actually looks like, these are images of the core drilling. On the left is a drill. Of course, they have to be incredibly stable and straight because they're going down about 50 feet in some cases, straight down. They're not very big. You can see the third picture here, the man's feet. You can see a hole. They then put steel rebar in these holes, and they couldn't then just come back and pour concrete down those holes because the moisture in the concrete would then bleed out all through the building, and the ornament of the building would be damaged. So they put the steel in, and then they used a resin. And the resin was a slow pour, and it became this very hard but flexible column now that you have throughout the building. So, and then this is some of what came up. When they drilled down, they would pull up. So these pieces here are about this big around and are solid, in some cases solid granite, some cases there were pieces of brick. This one on the left was from a wall that was all made of brick. They had to take off all the balustrades, all the capstones. It was pretty remarkable. Of course, we had to catalog everything. We cataloged all the lighting. We cataloged every piece of stone that we had to take out of the building to move for renovation. And this image here reminds me of the Indiana Jones, at the end of Indiana Jones movie. Here are all the balusters and the capstones. Every one of them had to get a pin put in, and of course had to be identified where it went back in the building while this system was being built. And so the rest of that core drill system, so then this is on the roof of the building. The existing roof of the building was a thin concrete shell sitting on steel trusses. So what they did was they had these rods sticking up from all the cores. They laid carbon fiber sheets around the edge, and then they created these big concrete beams around the roof, and then those pins would come up from the columns, the core columns, tied into the rebar of the concrete. And so this whole thing then, the whole entire roof, became a huge diaphragm tied together by 166 columns that went down into the basement. And then in the basement, big concrete piers, because we could then dig foundation beams. So you have piers down under the columns, under all these cores, and then beams cut into the floor that then poured concrete, so it would tie it all together. So you had a diaphragm on the roof, these cores coming down through the building, and then essentially a diaphragm at the foundation on the bottom of the building. So essentially, we built a building inside the existing building and didn't affect any of the building except in one area. The only area that we had some challenges with, this area, the big banking hall is to the right of these two photographs. To the left, through those doorways, are the banking offices. And this was pretty much the least ornamented part of the building. It was called the customer waiting area. And so what they came up with was to do a shear wall that connected through from the basement all the way up through the building. But again, they didn't want to use concrete. So they came up with what is a steel shear wall. I believe it's the first one in California that was done. And what we did was we made plaster casts of the cornice there, and then the marble base could just be removed and cataloged. The doorway frames are pressed metal, so those could easily be removed and put back into place. The other problem with concrete was that it would change the thickness of the wall. So we had to somehow find a way to keep the wall the same thickness. That wall is made of hollow clay tile. And while hollow clay tile is excellent in a fire, it is a disaster in an earthquake. And this became one of the exit paths of the building, so we had to make sure that this was a safe passage across there. So on the left, they did this kind of corrugated steel plate vertically, and then a grid work of steel horizontal battens and vertical columns, essentially. And then in the basement was tied into large concrete foundations, and you can kind of see the dirt there. That was a footing under this particular wall. So a pretty innovative way to save the building from earthquake damage. The other piece that was kind of a tricky dance was the getting fire sprinklers into the building. You can see the ceiling plan of the banking hall and the main rotunda here on the bottom right. Where you had the panels, it was fairly easy to say, we'll put a sprinkler head right in the middle of the panel. But we had these huge skylight domes. And so we had two problems. One is that it's all made of leaded glass, and lead melts at a fairly low temperature. So you have the issue of the potential of glass raining down into that big banking hall. And then the other is, how do you get water to those areas? Because you have large areas where potentially there would be no water coming down in case of a fire. So what's the bottom left photograph here is the skylight, and then above it is the greenhouse piece over it. So there's a whole room up there. And we were up there, and if you look at the top photograph, in the middle of the skylight, there's a narrow oval band there. And that is a band about 4 or 5 inches high, made of bronze, and it's got little slots in it. And it was the venting of the building. So in both domes, the center ring of the smaller skylight and that inner ring of the bigger skylight, and you can kind of see it in this photograph, had all these slots for ventilation, so the air would rise up, and then these greenhouses had ventilation, so it was a way to create a convection current through the building. So I pat myself on the back because I came up with this idea of putting fire sprinklers through those holes in the vents. So what would happen, of course, is if those sprinklers go off, they shoot water across the dome on the lower side of the dome where the fire might be. We also, of course, put sprinklers up in this upper area as well. But then also, that water would then drop down and cover the area that was not covered otherwise. So it was, this is why I called this threading the needle, because this was kind of the issue with the building. In this particular building, we threaded the needle. All of the different systems were put into the building. So this is the restoration. This again is the ceiling over the exterior entrance rotunda. It's a pretty beautiful thing. The walls are granite, but this is all plaster work. And there was a lot of work done to replicate a lot of breakage that was there. But again, the columns themselves, most of it was just a cleaning job. This is the bank now. Hard to tell in this picture, but the exterior, of course, completely cleaned. These are the entry doors into the banking hall, and you can see on the bottom there some of the different marbles. Again, those were, it was all repointed, that whole floor was repointed and cleaned. These doors, when we arrived at the project, we didn't know there were pocket doors there because they had typical storefront 1970s bronze-colored aluminum crappy doors that filled that space. And when those were taken out, what we discovered was a track up on top that had this gear, like a rack and pinion gear in your car. And then we could see there was a slot there, and we were able to pull out and found these doors that were in terrible condition because they're pressed metal. So they were rusted. There was a lot of twisting in them. It's hard to see, but there were, a number of pieces missing. But these were lovingly restored. We rebuilt the rack and pinion gears, and there's a crank that you can put in, and we had a couple of cranks so that they can open and close these doors. And then there's another set of doors to the left of this photo. This is the banking hall as it was completed. The windows are now open. The metal shades were made electric, so you didn't have to crank down each one. Just below those windows, there was a big nut sticking out of the wall, and so they had these cranks so they could crank down those big metal shutters. The other thing that's pretty amazing is the top arch of the windows, they pivot. And those were also made electronic, so you could get up there, and you didn't have to get up there and somehow have a hook to get up there to pull those windows open, but they pivot for ventilation. So also pretty amazing.
So is the whole bank just on one floor, or is there a second?
No, there's other. I'll show you in a second. Yes, it's really just it's 3 stories. There's a basement level that was, and I'll get to that. There was the main floor for the banking hall, and the second floor was law offices, and I'll show you that in a second. So this is the main vault, and just mostly a cleaning here. That clock up there is one of the most remarkable and most beautiful things that I've ever seen. And again, I can't even imagine being the architect drawing that. And I don't know how much was drawn and how much was left to a craftsman. But, and also pretty remarkable because there's a whole pulley system that's up above in a room above to run that clock. That was all restored so the clock would run. So this is the main banking hall. And then that's another one of these remarkable, this is the new skylight from 1904, 1905, the new skylight, also pretty remarkable. We don't know for sure, Pice's brother, now I'm forgetting his first name, I think it was Etienne Pices, was a glass artist, and he did stained glass windows at the Temple Shereth Israel. We don't know if he did these, but they're certainly modeled on, Tiffany style glass at the time. So to answer your question, the doors on the other side of the rotunda, the Tobin family was one of the founding families of the bank, and the Tobin law firm was located on the second floor offices of this building through the entire tenure from the time it opened until it closed in 1985. So this is a secondary staircase that goes up to the upper floor. Again, this is a bronze handrail, pretty remarkable, beautiful entry space. The doors in that left-hand picture are pocket doors as well, similar to the ones I showed you. And this is the top of the stair. That skylight goes to the roof, and we had to get steel all through this area because it's right next to the dome. And we essentially, they designed a steel collar around the dome. So this skylight was detached, mounted in wood framing, and removed and brought off site, and then all the steel went in, and there's an interstitial space from the ceiling up to the underside of the roof that's about 3 or 4 feet high. So steel was brought in to help brace the steel trusses that were in there, and then also to create this collar around the dome. These are some of the offices. The 2 pictures on the left are the banking offices. Again, you can see some of the different marbles of those fireplaces. And then in the middle photo, the steel shear wall is on the other side of that wall right there, on the right side of that middle photograph. So these were the rooms that we were trying to protect so that we wouldn't have to tear down these walls to build shear walls through the building. All the lighting, again, oh, and these are, on the right is the reception area of the Tobin law offices. Again, all the lighting was taken down, cleaned, restored, and replaced with LED lighting. Yeah, pretty amazing. This is the basement space. You can see here on the left the cast iron column, the steel I-beams that supported a brick vaulting to support the floors. And then this is on the right is the addition. And then by 1904, it was engineered in concrete. Again, this is one of the early uses of concrete in the United States. This floor was filled mostly with boilers and storage and equipment, a lot of mechanical equipment for the building. So one of the ways we expanded the use of the building was we were able to clear this out and created about 8,000 square feet of usable space that's accessible. The building is not smack up against other buildings. There's a north alley and a west alley. So the west alley goes right out to McAllister Street. So there's ways to get into this space without coming through the main banking hall. So for the kind of businesses that are popular in San Francisco now, some of the tech businesses and startups, this is exactly the kind of space that they're looking for. These are some pictures of the vaults. The one on the left was particularly historic because after the earthquake decimated the city hall, a significant amount of the city paperwork ended up in this vault for about 8 or 9 years before the new city hall was built. And these are just some other gates to the vaults in the building. So that's pretty much that story of the bank building. Sadly, just above the Hibernia Bank sign, while we were still under construction, a video went viral with some guys crawling up the framework of the scaffolding and going up above and graffitiing all around the circular stonework above. And what was really pretty miraculous about that was that there were people filming it and people filming the guys up there doing it. So rather than calling the police, they were saying, oh, isn't that cool? Look, people are graffitiing the building. Fortunately, we were able to get most of it off. You can still see some of the ghosting of that. But pretty, and the police knew who it was and they just couldn't catch them. So, yeah.
Estimate of the renovation cost?
About $11 million. So that's pretty much it. I did want to conclude tonight with a response to a question that Raymond asked me many years ago. When he found out I was working on this, Raymond had seen a number of the modern houses that I had designed. And so he asked me the question, how does a modernist do preservation? So I've been pondering that for many years, and I thought this would be the right place to at least come to give you some thoughts on that. And I think the answer to the question does not lie in the how. It lies more in the modern. And what I had to sort of think about was I really a modern architect in the traditional sense of what I think Raymond thinks of as a modern architect, and most people would think of as a practitioner of modern architecture. So a little background. I came to the love of modern somewhat genetically. Although I was born in New Jersey, I was conceived in Black Mountain, North Carolina, the home of the famous Black Mountain College. Some of you may have heard of it. It was established by many of the Bauhaus faculty that had fled Germany. And it was established during the war and lasted until the late 1950s. So my parents moved into that area because my father was in the textile industry. But my mother was very into design, and I'm sure she had some interest in the local art school. She did become an interior designer, so I'm sure that the apple didn't fall that far from the tree. Her father was a furniture salesman, but he was pretty cutting edge for his day. So when they returned to New Jersey, she furnished their home with pieces from his store, which were things like Eames chairs, Gilbert Rhodey chests, Noguchi and Safati lamps. So I grew up around a lot of very seminal, important, modern furniture. But she was no purist. Sprinkled among the modern were chain-swagged chandeliers, Delft-tile kitchen backsplashes, and an elaborately classical-derived desk and chair in our living room. But it occurred to me that perhaps her eclecticism was really my genetic influence. The first houses that I ever drew, starting from about the age 12, were decidedly modern, with big open spaces, bedrooms that floated like islands inside glass-walled courtyards, and I have yet to get that one built. The first course that I took in college in architecture, in architectural history, was called The History of Modern Architecture, which seemed like a strange title. It's kind of an ironic clashing of terms. What I discovered under the guidance of Margaret Henderson Floyd, who was one of the preeminent New England architectural historians, was that modern architecture did not spring fully mature from the head of Zeus. It was really part of a long stream of history that started with the Industrial Revolution. And I even learned, to my shock and surprise, that Frank Lloyd Wright was really, in essence, a 19th century arts and crafts architect. Oh, say it isn't so. But not that there weren't any, breakthrough moments, shock of the new, or throw off the shackles of history moments. There certainly were. But ultimately, so much of what is called modern is rooted in the stream of history. I know that my own modern designs are referential and often deferential to great modern work. I had the honor of leading Dion Neutra on a tour of a house that I designed in Los Altos. He asked me where I had come up with the concept for the design. And I said that when I started, I often thought, WWND, what would Neutra do? Because I really liked the work of Richard Neutra. And he was kind of a curmudgeon, and he grumbled under his breath some expletive that I won't repeat, but I think he was smiling at that thought. So I think the key to all this is that I had to ask myself, was I really truly a modern architect? And maybe the question really is, how does a preservationist do modern? So anyway, thank you very much. Thanks for joining me tonight. And any questions? Yeah.
What is being done with the building now? What's happening in it?
Well, that, of course, is a very important and good question. It's the area around the Hibernia Bank, the mid-market area, is changing quickly. Right across the street on McAllister and Market is a flatiron-shaped building that's been renovated. It just opened last fall, called the Proper Hotel, very trendy, hip hotel. But on the other side, going up Jones Street, just one or two buildings, is the St. Anthony's kitchen. And the area is still surrounded by many homeless people, and the streets are crowded with many scents of marijuana and other drug deals going on. So it's an area that's in transition. So they have had trouble finding a tenant. I believe they have a tenant now. I've been conferring with them on, for a tech company. Looking at it for that, but I don't know when and if that's going to be finalized. So it's still empty right now.
Huh. And what would that big bank space be used for?
Right. Well, that's part of the challenge. The building was landmarked in 1981, and then just in the past few months, the planning department and the preservation planners have put up landmarking the interior now that it's done. So that creates certain challenges. So the owner has done renderings with that space as a restaurant, as a social space. Actually, the building was completed in early 2016, and the first event that we had in that space was a rally for Hillary Clinton, which I was at. It was really just incredible. There were about 400 people in the room there. So it could be used for that kind of a space. They've also rendered with desks for, a tech company, to work in there as well. Yeah.
I just saw recently, and it could have been on 60 Minutes, I'm not sure. There's a tall high-rise in San Francisco that's sinking.
Yes.
Can you tell us something about that?
Well, yeah, off topic, but it's called the Millennium. It's a 800 foot high, 650 foot high building that is sinking. It has sunk about 18 inches and tilted off axis about 15 or 16 inches. And it's a much bigger topic. I mean, There are things being done right now. I mean, engineers are looking at it. I suspect that the lawsuits will go on for decades. I mean, one of the basic principles of what happened is that they did not take the piers under the building. It's built in an area that was landfill originally. They did not take the piers all the way down to bedrock, which is about 200 feet below, and they did something called friction piles. So of course, as you're pushing down in the mud, it gets harder and harder to push, and at some point, you get the balance between the weight of the building pushing down and the force of the mud pushing up. So that's how they designed it, which is, there are many other buildings in San Francisco designed that way. One of the mitigating factors, however, is that the Trans Bay Terminal is being built right next to it, and they're going down 30 feet or 40 feet, and they're pumping water out of the hole that they dug there, and they think that that changed the equilibrium of the soils, and so that's kind of a very basic explanation of that. Anybody else? There was a guy in the back. Yeah.
I was wondering about how San Francisco utilizes or works with conservation districts versus historic districts.
You know, it's something that I still don't really understand. I mean, I know why they were why they were established, in different ways. They certainly could have become historic districts in 1985, but it was an area that was, the downtown plan was a huge, zoning plan in 1985 that was specific to the downtown area and the fringes, which was up to the Union Square area. I can't tell you why they called them something different. They're treated pretty much the same way. If you're doing any work on a building in a conservation district or designing a new building in a district, it still comes through the same channels. It shows up at the Historic Preservation Commission and basically treated the same way. So I'll have to find that out, why they called them something different. I don't know. Yeah, over here.
Just wondering, in what direction is preservation in San Francisco headed? Is it more conservation, more preservation, or is it starting to reach some equilibrium or less? And what about the CEQA 50-year guideline? Is that having an impact?
Yeah, it's. I mean, I'm a practicing architect, and then I also I wear these two hats, and often that's in conflict. So basically in CEQA they look at about a 50-year timeline for when a building can be considered historic. In some cases it can be less than that. But in San Francisco they use 45 years because sadly it takes years to get permits. So they're assuming that by the time the building becomes 50 years, they've been reviewing it for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So 45 years is the cutoff in San Francisco. And that just basically means that it's reviewed for its historic character. I find that San Francisco, of any of the cities that I've lived in or know about, is pretty much, I think the preservation staff is the most conservative. My standard line is, I hold my fingers up like that, and you see that splinter? That splinter is not from the cross of Christ. It's an old piece of wood. So they often have trouble, walking that line and saying, "Oh, guess what? That's an old piece of wood. You can do something. You can change that." Or, "Oh my God, that's really from the cross of Christ. We should preserve that." I think they always err on the cover, CYA, cover your ass side of making sure that they save it rather than anything else. But again, that creates very strange buildings because of parts that are preserved and then other parts that are built, additions that are done. So that's one problem. The other problem is it changes land values quite dramatically. So it becomes a huge political issue because all of a sudden that piece of property has dropped significantly in value because I can build up to 1,000 feet on that property, but I've got a 2-story building on it that I can't change. So it becomes a big political game as well. And we deal with that on the Historic Preservation Commission and through environmental impact reports. But environmental impact reports are often done for somewhat dubious reasons. The things that they think are significant, throw it into an environmental impact report, which can take 1.5 to 2 years to do, cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then, of course, what we find out is that particular thing that we knew at the beginning wasn't that significant is still not that significant. And the result that we knew was going to happen was that building could either be torn down or mitigated in some other way, is still what happens. So I think they go overboard a lot, and so I think we've kind of swung to a very, which in some cases is excellent, a much more conservative view of preserving the city. I mean, right now, like in the 80s when the downtown plan came out, there was rapid change. We're in that same place now. I mean, if any of you have been in San Francisco recently, there's construction on every street, everywhere, and it's hard for the governmental body to keep up with the pace of change. So their default is to default way on the side of conservatism, which is probably, a reasonable thing relative to not losing certain things. But certainly they don't seem to have a really fine eye to discernment. And the commission itself does not control the staff. We advise the staff. And so they're always bringing stuff to us. So, it's not that we can tell them to do something. We can advise them to do something. And then we see what projects come along. And then, of course, when there's bigger issues that are code related or things that are changing, one of the big issues is facadism, where people retain a facade that's seen from the street and then tear down the whole building. Well, that's basically a full demolition. But that, we've had a lot of discussion about, do we legislate about how we control facadism? So there's a lot of issues like that are coming up. It's challenging in times, where there's incredible financial and political pressure. Yeah.
On the topic of local agency legislation, two things of concern around here are demolition by neglect,
Yes.
as well as quote-unquote illegal demolition.
Right. Sure. Yeah. There's.
How can we address that?
It's one, literally at our last meeting, we had, there was an article in the Chronicle about two houses, one by Richard Neutra and one by Willis Polk, who's one of the most significant San Francisco 19th and 20th century, early 20th century architect, houses that were torn down. It's a tricky problem because in the case of this Richard Neutra house, the house itself had been remodeled many times and the integrity of the original design was long gone. But the architect who designed an addition, a renovation and addition to this house, went through the whole process. Everything went through, got permits, it was all approved, and within about a day or 2 days, the architect came out to the site and found 2 walls of the garage left. The entire house had been torn down. So the challenge is, how do you legislate about somebody who does something completely illegally? It's the same thing as if someone commits a crime. They committed a crime, essentially. And the way you legislate is you create penalties and things. This other one, exactly, I see you shaking your head. This other house, the Willis Polk house, was torn down. It's over in the neighborhood near the Wiggly part of Lombard Street. So a very, very nice neighborhood, very expensive homes. This was a fairly substantial house on an open piece of land. So it was almost like a farmhouse on a big piece of land, which in San Francisco is unheard of these days. I think he paid $3 or $4 million for a very rundown, deteriorated house. And he knew that his plans were, by the time this was done, it was going to be a $30 million project. So he again, went through the process, got permits, all that, and tore down the house. And the fine for that was $400,000, which was the biggest fine ever levied against someone who committed that particular crime. The problem is $400,000 wasn't much for a guy who thought, well, I'm going to get $30 million for the finished project. So he's happy to pay that. So Aaron Peskin, who's one of the supervisors in San Francisco, he and his wife consider themselves to be the protectors of all of San Francisco. Peskin has talked about far more substantial penalties. One of the penalties that has been in place for quite a long time, as long as I've been practicing in the city, about 25 years, is that when a building is built, is torn down illegally, you can't build on that property for 5 years. Now the problem with that, of course, is that the only people it hurts are its neighbors, because then you've got a hole, this construction site that sits in the middle of a neighborhood. So they realize that's not really much of a disincentive, other than at the time that was put in place, losing your investment for 5 years was a big incentive. And there were only 1 or 2 projects that were actually subject to that. But now money talks. So Peskin is looking at, and I'm sure it'll come through our commission, about what kind of penalties can be levied that will have some force. Because all of this is civil law, unfortunately. It's not criminal law. You can't take the developer and throw him in jail. But it's a challenge we're looking at. We're trying to figure out. Yeah.
Just get tacked off to the Endangered Species Act.
Yeah, exactly, right.
Have a taking and
Yeah, exactly. And then they could take the property back. I don't know. I don't know what would be good. Raymond?
so I think it's with the lizard that we think we should be able to do it.
That would be, it'd be an interesting. I like that. I'll bring that up. Yeah.
It is a question that why couldn't you put someone in jail? That might get someone more attention.
Right. Then money.
Quentin for a while with the other nice guys. That would be a disincentive to do this stuff.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about who are the stakeholders that care about preservation in the development community? Who are the people that are the champions for this, and why?
And why? That's going to be a harder question to answer. Probably starting maybe a decade or so ago, there are a lot of hammers in development in San Francisco. San Francisco, as a city, has the only fully discretionary zoning in the state of California. And basically what that means is that if you have as-of-right zoning, if you design something that's within the code, you can go ahead and get your permit. There's no review of that if it meets all the requirements that's written in the code. Discretionary zoning basically says that at every point of approval, it can be appealed. So on most of our projects, there are anywhere between 4 and 6 points of appeal. So it's one of the reasons why it takes forever to build a building in San Francisco, because even in addition to a house can get appealed a number of times, and it can take 2 years to get a permit to do a small addition to a house. So that was, that's been going on for many years. Starting about a decade ago, the newest hammer was the historic hammer. And one of the reasons why we need a citywide survey is because how do we establish if a building has any sort of history? Because if you look at a building per se, like I talked about, the cultural history, for instance, Jerry Garcia's house, Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead, grew up in the Excelsior district of San Francisco. His house is a landmark. It's a crappy little house. It's certainly, if someone didn't know that, it would have been torn down like that if someone wanted to. So we need more, more of that. And I think it's important that it has valid meaning to the culture. And I can tell you privately some stories about, where they didn't have valid reasons and they still tried to, save buildings. But ultimately, there are a few developers. Tom Hunt, amazingly, the guy that owns the Hibernia Bank building, I'm not sure he knew what he was getting into when he bought the bank building, but did spend a significant amount of money on a building that is going to take a very long time to pay for itself, but was willing to do the job to save this building and to really respect its fabric. There are, so the stakeholders, truly the Preservation Department of San Francisco is there are 13 staff members. It's a very educated group of people. And every project, again, if it's 45 years or older, has to have a complete historic resource evaluation done. So, and that's done, the project sponsor has to do that work. And there's a list of historians that are sanctioned by the department. So, and then the architect can't write that report. So I can't write a report for any of my projects because, I mean, I have a conflict now, but even as the architect, they think you have a conflict of interest because you may want to eliminate any historical value of a building. So those are done by private consultants. And through the process, virtually any building that's considered a historic resource, additions and renovations have to meet the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation. So there's a lot of work that one has to go through with any building that's considered a historic resource.
But you're telling me how the rubber meets the road, but
Right.
it takes political will to even start a process like that. So
Right.
I'm curious about who are the people that had the political will to get these 13 people in the
Right.
staff.
Well, people like Peskin, Supervisor Aaron Peskin, there's a number of politicians who think that, I mean, there's always a group of San Franciscans who think that, San Francisco is the greatest spot on the planet of the earth. And, there are a number of groups, San Francisco Architectural Heritage, there's a lot of groups, neighborhood associations, the one in Telegraph Hill neighborhood, they're called the Telegraph Hill Dwellers. I always think of them as cave dwellers, but they're hill dwellers, are a very vocal group to support preservation. There's a general sentiment in San Francisco about keeping the character of the city. I mean, the cultural and the cultural historical districts have come from the community. They haven't come from the staff. From the governmental level. These are coming from neighborhood groups who are coming forward and saying, we want to save our buildings. We've had probably 8 or 10 landmark reports written by community members who are bringing buildings forward to the staff and helping us, because that saves us a lot of time in the process of reviewing to get them to be landmarks. Each of the supervisors are responsible. Any landmarking that's happening in their district, they're the ones who have to carry it through for legislation. So we have a lot of relationship with the supervisors' offices. And every one of them would not be in office if they let significant buildings disappear from their districts. We're working on the renovation of the Alexandria Theater, which is out on Geary Boulevard at 18th Avenue. And it's a great 1923 Egyptian-style building. And the supervisor this is the biggest project in District 1 in the city, and the supervisor is 100% behind us. She's writing letters of support and making sure that the project gets done. So there is some political will that's coming from all the supervisors. I think it's really coming from the neighborhoods. I think most of it, the legacy businesses, they're all coming from the neighborhoods. The heritage districts, all coming from the neighborhoods, and even individual landmarks are now coming from the individuals, the owners, and people from their neighborhoods. So, yeah.
You mentioned the Fox Theater. Were you ever in it?
No. I didn't arrive in San Francisco till 1989, so sadly Fox Plaza, the building that's there, that hideous, ugly building that's there, was there when I got there, so,
My dad
no.
helped record all the organs.
Really? Oh. I've seen lots of pictures of it. It's pretty spectacular.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Where do you live?
I live in Russian Hill, San Francisco, just up on Green Street, just up the hill from Hyde, from the cable cars. So we have cable cars going by our windows. So anyway, thank you very much. Any other questions? Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.